Well, Renad Mansour is a fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center. He can join us now live from Toronto to share some of his insight on what we've been hearing from the United Nations. Renad, thanks for joining us. How encouraged are you by what you've seen out of the UN today? Are these real steps being taken now to bring peace to Syria?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there is an element of it being an unprecedented move to have, the Security Council come to any form of agreement on Syria. I mean, for the last 5 years, this is what's been missing. And a lot of hope was lost that the United Nations as an institution or as an organization could actually come to the table and even pretend to meet at some point to try and form some transition or to some future for Syria. So there is an element of it being a distinct moment. And there also is a sense of urgency. I mean, you see there's the time frame now. Before there was never time frames, but they have a time frame. They want to reach a ceasefire in a month's time. They want to reach elections in 18 months' time. So the time frame as well, they're setting goals and they're setting limits for themselves. So there is, to an extent, something distinct to the Vienna process, which is what we're in today.
Do you think, Renad, the opposition groups that met in Saudi just a few weeks ago will actually be able to sit down with Bashar al-Assad for productive negotiations as early as next month, as the UN is hoping? Do you think that's a bit too optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, it is optimistic, and it's not perfect. I mean, there is, again, a sense of willingness by the opposition groups to unite in vis-a-vis the threat of Assad, which kind of brings them together. So there is, to a general extent, a coming together of these groups. However, there are internal differences between the groups. As we saw in the opposition meeting, one of the bigger groups, one of the rebel groups, Ahrar al-Sham, withdrew from the talks. And, people were celebrating them being at the talks. The fact that they withdrew means that there are fissures within the opposition movement that kind of question the optimism of an opposition movement sitting down and meeting with Assad. But as I say again, there is a sense of urgency, there is a sense of time frame, which means that perhaps the groups can say maybe unity for now is a good thing to get, to meet with the regime and talk about the future rather than this protracted conflict and protracted civil war which has engulfed our, country.
Right. Renad, when we last spoke and world powers were meeting to discuss Syria, you had expressed your dismay at the fact that the Syrian opposition, as well as other major players, were being left out. So does this gathering at least better represent everyone's interests?
Definitely, and that was one of the biggest problems, was that the future of Syria was for a long time being decided by foreign powers. And if you think about why now, it's also a reason foreign powers are interested and kind of pushing it, right? I mean, you look at, for the longest time, the US and Iran were more engulfed in their own nuclear deal and other negotiations, and they kind of put Syria aside, and now they've come together to talk. So there is an element of foreign powers that are, calling the shots. But nonetheless, the foreign powers are acknowledging the fact that the negotiators need to be Syrians, need to be from the opposition. Now the problem is who the foreign powers will determine are, moderate or are legitimate representatives. And this is going to be an issue, I think, that we'll see. The definition of terrorist, who is a terrorist and who is an appropriate opposition member. We'll see squabbles over between the different foreign powers over who can represent Syrians.
Yes, we will. And it's always interesting to note how cordial and polite these leaders are in the context of these meetings. But the truth is they vehemently disagree over the most fundamental issues. So what happens if Russia refuses to stop its full support of Bashar al-Assad and continues on its separate axis from the United States and the rest of the Western governments involved?
And I think this is the elephant in the room. They're coming to all these agreements and timeframes, but there isn't really a clear idea of what happens to Assad. There isn't, because they can't even come too close to an agreement on this. They're so far apart and so far removed on the future of Syria with Assad or without Assad that they've kind of put it on the side and decided to call for a ceasefire and call for other things. But this they need to address sooner rather than later, because you don't want to go through this entire process for there to be a disagreement down the road. And for the time being, Russia insists that Assad becomes part of the future of Syria, whereas the U.S. says you can't have a Syria with Assad in it because he's lost all his legitimacy because of all the war crimes and the accusations that they put on him. So this, again, is a major, major question that they seem to be putting on the side and sidestepping for the moment.
They do it. I mean, it really is everything, because it seems there is no in-between. He can't play a role in a government with the opposition that has lost so many lives trying to remove him from power. There would be no scope for that, would there be?
Exactly. And I mean, there are different proposals being set out for some sort of transition, some sort of movement away, maybe Assad leaving, but parts of elements of his regime staying. I mean, there are different proposals being set, but at the end of the day, it is difficult to see him staying and his close aides staying in power. The opposition, they just wouldn't accept any form of government with him in.
So, Renad, what does Russia really want here?
Russia wants to maintain its influence, I think, in the Middle East.
How desperately?
It seems pretty desperately, the fact that they're now involved, engaged in Syria, and it seems like they're playing a game of chicken, and they're not budging, and they're moving forward, and they're very aggressive with Turkey. They're increasingly aggressive with other countries in the region, and to them, Syria has become something really important to them, and they don't want the regime to fall. And the reason why they became engaged in Syria in the first place was because they feared that Assad was on the brink of collapse, and so they needed to, stop that. So Russia seems to be very adamant that we need to get rid of the Islamic State. We need to get rid of some of the terrorists that have bred in the vacuum of not ungoverned spaces in Syria, and we need to maintain Assad for a plethora of reasons.
Okay, Renad Mansour, we're going to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining us.